Well, good evening, everyone. Sound check here in the USAS Hub in Calgary. You can hear me in the back? Yeah. We're good. And I'll also look to my our audio assistants, make sure I'm seeing thumbs up that we're good from there. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to not the first ever Dean Speaker Series, but the first ever Dean Speaker Series broadcast from the University of Saskatchewan Hub here in beautiful downtown Calgary, Alberta. We are delighted to be here for this evening's wonderful event of talking with a distinguished alumnus from the Edwards School of Business. My name is Keith Willoughby. I'm the Dean of the Edwards School of Business at the University of Saskatchewan and delighted to be the host for tonight's Dean Speaker Series. We do want to pay respect to the territories and lands upon which we are meeting this evening. We know that many of us from Saskatoon are familiar with our Treaty 6 acknowledgement that we sincerely offer at the beginning of events. But tonight, given that we are meeting here in beautiful downtown Calgary, we feel that we want to acknowledge Treaty 7 territory, the territory upon which we are meeting tonight. Treaty 7 territory in southern Alberta includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda, as well. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. In this acknowledgement, let us all pause to reflect and acknowledge the tremendous responsibility we have as part of truth and reconciliation to connect better as societies and communities. We can truly acknowledge and cherish the wonderful gifts we've been given in this land for which we are grateful. We are grateful this evening to be here in Calgary, joined with individuals here in our in-person environment, and I believe with nearly 200 individuals who are joining us in our live-streamed Dean Speaker Series. This is being live-streamed to our friends, alumni, faculty, staff in Saskatchewan, Alberta, across Canada, throughout the world. It's my pleasure in tonight's Dean Speaker Series to have a tableside, maybe not a fireside chat, but a tableside chat with Andrew Chau. And we are looking forward, Andrew, to getting to know more about your journey, your tremendous journey over the years in which you've had a substantial impact in businesses and societies in the world around you. Enough about me. You didn't come here tonight to hear all about me. We came here to hear about Andrew. So Andrew, we each have our mics with us, and maybe what we'll do first is I could just have you maybe offer a brief introduction of yourself, your background, where you're from, to the individuals here in person, as well as those joining live stream. Andrew, off to you for a short introduction.
Well, thanks for having me. This is really exciting, and it's I've never actually been to this hub before, and it's actually really, really cool. It looks brand new. It's a great space downtown here in Calgary, but it was sort of reflecting back to my university days when I was at U of S and trying to think back of, okay, when was Professor Willoughby my own professor? And I remember it was a class called Operations Management. I don't know if any of you took that class as well, but it was a mandatory, I think, class that we had to take. Right? Is that right?
It's a mandatory class that's important to take.
Okay, that's right. I think, I'm from Saskatoon, born and raised there, grew up in Parkridge, went to school there. I think when I was looking to, growing up in Saskatoon, was never really exposed to tech. Didn't really, know much about it. Ended up going to University of Saskatchewan, started to learn sort of a lot more, broaden my horizons. Still didn't know anything about tech at the time. But when I graduated, had an opportunity to sort of move into management consulting with a role at Boston Consulting Group in Toronto. So I ended up moving away for a number of years and did that for a number of years. And when I was sort of living abroad, quite a bit of traveling to sort of places like New York and London and San Francisco, had seen all these tech companies, coming to the bigger metros, but a lot of them were skipping over smaller markets, skipping over sort of the Midwest of Canada. And sort of had stayed in touch with some of my former classmates at the U of S as well. And one thing led to another, and that's sort of how Skip the Dishes sort of led me into that role in that company. And And then eventually sort of did a lot more after that.
Yeah,
a couple things after that.
Yeah, a lot more after that. And
But we can talk about that.
We'll discuss what a lot more means, and that could fill up 3 days worth of Dean Speaker Series.
Yeah.
By the way, just so people are aware, we do this event annually, typically the 3rd week of September. Our first time ever being with this virtual audience and this in-person audience here in Calgary. There's some questions that I'll be asking you, but we'll have time also for questions from our live stream participants as well as those here in Calgary. You mentioned, Andrew, going after your Bcom, joining the Boston Consulting Group, and then traveling to locations, New York, London, San Francisco. What was it about that experience of being in the United States, abroad, that really captured your attention and your enthusiasm?
Yeah, I think in those cities, you had started to see, this was back in 2011, 2012, where there were all of these tech companies basically doing on-demand everything, whether it was on-demand laundry, on-demand, meal kits, and then of course, on-demand food delivery and on-demand ride sharing. And all of these things were just happening in the midst of it. At the same time, when we were sort of working abroad, we're like, well, we're ordering quite a bit from these services back in the day. And we said, well, hey, people in Saskatoon also eat. This would be a great service to have back home too. And that's sort of where that idea sort of got kicked off and sort of enlisted, obviously, I guess my other co-founder enlisted his brothers who were software developers, also U of S grads. And that's sort of how the first, website of Skip the Dishes got started. And it was really, like, to be honest, we didn't really know what we were doing at the time. It was really just a, learn by trial and by fire. And that's sort of, what inspired us was like, how do we just bring all this cool tech to the prairie cities? Really.
So what was your role specifically then with the Skip the Dishes operation? Yeah,
so my role, in a startup, you usually don't have like a defined role. I wasn't a coder, I wasn't in engineering. I had a B.Comm. So what do you do with the B.Comm? You do numbers, I guess. Is that right? Ops management, actually.
Good answer.
But to start off, it was, I did sales right at the beginning. So, helped launch cities. So we went door to door from restaurant to restaurant. For those in Calgary, myself, one of my other co-founders, we went from one end of 17th Avenue all the way down to the other end, knocking on doors, talking to owners, getting to sign up to a random service called Skip the Dishes. And half the time they thought we were selling dishes. Not a good thing. But you sort of learn over time the pitch, and then sort of shifted over to more of a marketing and growth role. And built the playbook to launch new cities, and then sort of evolved into fundraising, talking with investors, and spending more time on the finance side.
How did you decide which cities to go into? You mentioned obviously with the Calgary operation here. Yeah. How did you decide in terms of where you would grow from there?
Yeah, well, Saskatoon was our first city that we launched in, just because it was the city we were in. And the next logical city when you have no money is where can you drive to? And Regina was the next city.
Okay, very good.
Right. After that, it was of course Red Deer, because it's like, the city to grow into, again, driving distance. And then after that, we sort of had a choice between Winnipeg or Calgary. We actually ended up launching Winnipeg next, because we felt that it was actually around 2013, 2014. Calgary was way too expensive because the oil boom, we felt like we couldn't get any couriers or staff. So we said, let's launch Winnipeg instead. And we ended up, building up our other headquarters in Winnipeg as well at the time. And then, again, our focus at the time, and it's funny, we had business cards, right? So regardless of how large Skip is today, when we started, we had no ambition of like getting to that large. For our business cards, when we first started, said Western Canada's largest food delivery network. It was not Canada's largest, it was Western Canada's. I think, we even thought about putting Saskatoon's largest food delivery network to be really local and hyper-local. But we sort of thought a little bit ahead, a couple of months. But so that's sort of the mentality that we had when starting up Skip.
Okay, now you mentioned in your brief introduction that you did a lot of other stuff, that we're going to get to the other stuff that you did. But thinking back to your experiences with Skip the Dishes, what were some of the lessons you learned in either leadership or in time management or decision making that really influenced the rest of the career that you've had since then?
Yeah, I mean, going through that journey with Skip, you learn a lot of different things. You learn things, what to do and what not to do. And, with our next sort of venture with Neo Financial, I'd say, one of the couple different things, you when you're in it, you don't really learn a lot. You sort of just are just doing, and you're just trying to make things work and survive. And that's really the fit of survival. And with startups, with Neo this time around, we've sort of had time to reflect and sort of learn and say, okay, what worked, what didn't work. And I'd say one of the biggest pieces was, in hindsight, it's great, but it is all about people, right? I mean, companies are built, any company that we're at, all start with people, and they literally start with an idea, and you just need people to execute on them and build and work hard, whatever it might be. So I spent a lot more time focusing on that, with Neo Financial, and making sure we had the right people in the right roles, and spending a lot more time on recruitment, getting people, networking, and similar to that was also thinking more long term. I think with Skip, we didn't think that long term. We were sort of, again, just trying to figure out how to
become Saskatoon's biggest.
Exactly. And this time around, it's been really around, okay, how do we build more of a generational company, and sort of starting with that in mind. Whereas before, we were just trying to build something really cool that our friends would use, which is still a good goal. But it was more just, it's a bit, more shorter term for sure.
So pivoting to the role that you've had at Neo Financial, when you look at the experiences thus far with the company, and by the way, maybe just provide a bit of a synopsis of sort of where the company began, much like you did with Skip the Dishes. Sure. So where the Neo Financial idea, where was it spawned, and some of the key opportunities that have happened since its launch? Sure.
So, with Skip the Dishes, we started out with literally 5 of us, or actually started out with fewer of us, and then eventually we all sort of came full time into Skip. That scaled to much larger than any financial forecast that I put together. Today it's over 3,000 employees across the country, doing just over, I think, $3.5–4 billion in sales just in Canada alone. And learned a lot through that experience, right? At a certain point in time, you lose that effect of sort of starting from 0 to 1. And myself and some of my other co-founders wanted to start something from scratch again, and really saw an opportunity, working with about 35,000 small businesses, restaurants, and so on, to an opportunity to help them. One thing that we found in common across all of them was that they weren't very good at marketing. They didn't really have data. There's no insights. They didn't have the capacity or the ability to, launch their own loyalty programs or have credit card programs like a Superstore or a Walmart would have. So we said, well, what if we could help these restaurants with getting them more customers? And we built more of a loyalty platform for them. So it sort of evolved into, building what our first product is at Neo is basically a card that has 7,000 loyalty programs on top of it. And at the same time, we have consumers who get a really great experience with one card. They get cash back at a bunch of different places. That was really the starting point. We as we started to dig in more and more, we started to realize, hey, banking in Canada is really broken. You've got these big 5 banks that own 93% market share. It's called an oligopoly, but in reality, it's more like a monopoly. And there really isn't much innovation in that space. And, very similar to back when in our Skip days where we said, well, there's all of these, tech-driven innovations on our phone. You can order food on it. You can order your laundry. You can order whatever you want, delivered in less than an hour. But your banking isn't really, up to par. It's not really meeting our expectations. And for us, it's really around how do we create a better experience for Canadians? How do we, another, key fact or example is, Canadians pay the highest bank fees in the world, even though we're very developed, right? Which I find is just amazing. And it's a big due part because of the lack of competition. So, coming back to where we started with a card, we said, well, let's actually expand that. Let's go after and be a true challenger to the banking space here in Canada.
So you mentioned several nuggets in that response. We just want to touch base on a few of them. So 7,000 loyalty programs
Today, yeah.
Okay. And thinking back, what was your initial goal with that? Was it just a few hundred, a few dozen? With the 7,000 seems like an incredible reach that you've already had with Neo.
Yeah, I mean, our goal, when I think back, it was definitely higher than 7,000. Like we're still, like we've only been live for a year and a half. So we've been, our goal is to get as many businesses as possible. There's over several 100,000 in Canada. So whether it's, the mom and pop local cafes all the way to the the Struck Tubes or the Home Depots of the world, like we work with both sizes. And again, really just trying to create more of an ecosystem of merchants with consumers. And for those of you who don't know, or who here has Neo? Yeah, we get hands up. Yay. For those of you who don't have Neo yet, you can download the app. Shameless plug. But really it's a card. You get all the cash back from all these different places, and really just that digital experience across the board as well. Yeah.
What does it take for Canadians to accept that new model? You mentioned about the Canadian banking system, in your words, being broken.
Yeah.
So what does it take for Canadians to adjust to this new reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think Canadians are, and maybe just, Canadians in general, I would say they need to see value in terms of, their willingness to switch. And I think banking, a lot of people say banking is really competitive, right? People say, oh, it's really hard to get into the space. I mean, just the number of people that said, oh, you're crazy to get into the banking space. It's really difficult. Many people have tried to do it and they just haven't really succeeded. And that's true if you look and feel exactly the same as everyone else, right? So if you think about the big 5 banks today, if you were to strip out the colors, strip out the logos from their websites, you would not be able to tell the difference between any of them because they have the same products, the same features, the same functionality, right? I used to consult for a lot of these banks in prior days, and we would do projects that would like compare and contrast against, okay, our bank account is $14.99. Can we increase the price by $1? Yes or no? Right? And those are the types of innovation that a lot of these banks are really focused on. The second is these banks really are on a lot of legacy technology. So they're generally it's actually most of their systems and platforms are on mainframes. They're written in a language called COBOL. COBOL is a language written 40 years ago, or even more than that. And I always thought it was a myth that they would have to actually, if they wanted to change code in these systems, they actually have to pull people out of retirement to change the systems. I thought it was a myth, but I have confirmed that fact with many people at these banks, that there's very few people who actually still work and know this language. So that's really what we're up against when we're sort of thinking about competition. So when it comes to competition, it's, yes, all the banks are very competitive because they all look and feel exactly the same. But when we come into market with a different product, different pricing, different experience, partnerships as well, then that's sort of how we think about winning in the space that is more competitive.
When you talk about the COBOL language, and I'm not a COBOL expert,
Okay.
I do believe the Excel spreadsheet is humankind's greatest invention. So that's my tech experience.
Yeah.
But I know in talking to some of our alumni from the 70s who in the College of Commerce mentioned punch cards and learning code like that. So what you're talking about is not far from reality in terms of, you think that the legacy programs were students back then, that was the technology that was used. You mentioned the ability to really understand what drives consumer value. How did your experiences, again, of sort of seeing different models in other countries, United States and in countries in Europe, really influence the vision that you brought to Neo Financial? Yeah,
I think it's there's a lot of elements that you can take from different parts of the country, obviously different countries, different cultures. At the end of the day, we're all sort of human, right? And I think there's human elements that we can sort of pull and take. And when we look to other countries, it's great because typically Canada's about 7 years behind on any tech innovation, right? So you think about Netflix, right? Netflix is okay now, but back in the day, 7 years ago, Netflix was really terrible. The selection was really, really bad. Think about Amazon Prime, like we're the last country to get Amazon Prime, right? It's just things like that where, Canada's a little bit further behind. So we can look to other countries to say, what's working out there? And are there things that we can take elements of it and adapt it for Canada? And, that's sort of what gave us the inspiration for Skip at the beginning. But what works in New York doesn't necessarily work in Saskatoon either, right? And we learned that, very, very quickly where, we took the model that was in New York that has the density of like 50, I think they have more pizza shops than people, right? Pizza delivery shops. And so we said, well, let's just connect. Our first iteration of Skip was just connecting delivery restaurants with people. And we just wanted to be a middle person and just, skim off the top and be done with it. We quickly realized after we signed up the 15 restaurants that did delivery themselves, we were sort of done in Saskatoon. But there were actually like a couple hundred restaurants in Saskatoon. So then that's sort of when we said, well, what if we enabled these restaurants with delivery by doing the delivery ourselves? And that was really the step change that we learned to say, okay, well, now we have to build a courier network, operations management, a logistical network to actually facilitate the pickup and the ordering of delivery. And that was really like, yes, we took elements of something from abroad, but we actually adapted it for what worked in Saskatoon.
It's a fascinating response to be able to take that model, that value proposition you understood at Skip the Dishes and apply it to the people principle that you're seeing at Neo Financial. I want to confess that your comment about being 7 years behind for Canadians with technology is true, probably more so in my case. Andrew, I joined the 21st century earlier this week. I deposited a check with my iPhone. Yes, I actually figured out how I got this like check. And what do? I got to go to the bank? No. Anyway, I'm speaking, preaching to the choir here. So I'm getting there, Andrew. I'm getting there. So let's talk about some numbers, rapid fire round here. May 2022, 4 months ago. Let me get the numbers right here. Neo receives unicorn status. $185 million Series C fundraiser, $185 million. And a $1 billion, that's billion with a B, a $1 billion company valuation. How did you react? So come on. 4 months ago, that's
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge sort of validation of sort of what we're building. And of course the market we're going after. And I think, the investors that we've been able to bring on board are, I'd say, some of the smartest investors sort of out there. They've done this before, which is a huge validation. And so similar to my comment, they have done this before in other countries. So it's something that, I think sort of that there's that part of it. And then there's also the part of, hey, we can absolutely do this in the prairies, right? And I think ultimately when we think about, why we started Neo in the first place, why we started Skip, it was always a matter of how do we impact as many people as we can, and how do we do it so we don't have to be in San Francisco or New York? How do we do it right here at home? And I think that's a big part of sort of why we've been sort of doing what we're doing, why we chose Calgary or Saskatoon or Winnipeg as sort of places to build up our offices, build up our headquarters. Was really because it's always that like chip on our shoulder to say, yeah, of course we can build something really cool here.
Now I asked you earlier about roles when you were at Skip the Dishes, and you offered a really good response in terms of understanding that roles are quite different in an organization that's growing and evolving. With Neo Financial, do you have a particular role or a subset of activities that are part of your domain?
Yeah, I mean, this time around, I am, I guess, in the CEO role, whatever that means. But I'd say, one of the great things about a startup is that, again, it's all about people. So I have a really strong sort of team.
How many would be on the team?
So we've got, in total, we've got just over 650 people on our team today. I've got a really strong, I'd say, we have a founding team of 4 of us. And we all sort of have our different domains that we are in. So I'm more on the, I'd say, finance numbers side of things. My other co-founder is more on the operations and the day-to-day, just making things happen. Other co-founder is more on the partnerships side. Other co-founder is on the tech side. So we sort of have these like complementary skill sets where, we all trust each other to be the best at each of those domain areas. Like I can't speak on the tech side, but I can And my tech co-founder doesn't speak much on the finance side, but we all sort of work together on that front. And that's sort of how, me, myself, I wouldn't be able to build Neo because there's a lot of different moving parts. But when you combine not just the four of us, but the whole team, like the 600 plus people that we have, you actually create something that's never been built before, which I find that's probably the most interesting thing about like a startup is you can literally start something from nothing.
True. And I think you've really articulated a growth strategy that Neo has. I guess my question to you is, how do you grow, but grow intelligently so you don't become too big too fast?
Yeah, I mean, that's always like a huge balancing act of making sure we're growing at a reasonable rate and not at all costs, but at a reasonable cost. I think, with the opportunity we're going after, the good thing is, banking is an area that is proven, right? You can look at the profits of any of the big 5 banks and it's extremely large, maybe too large. So we know the market is there. And I think it's just a matter of, being quick enough and nimble enough to find ways to grow in a manner that is efficient.
So are you after that 93% market share that the big 5 have?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
And would you measure growth in terms of loyalty programs that you'd have as part of Neo Financial, or is it more in terms of market share of your customer reach?
Yeah, it's a combination of a bunch of different sort of KPIs and metrics, but ultimately it's how many people are we impacting, how many people use Neo, how many small businesses are we impacting as well, how much revenue we're generating for them. So yeah, a lot of different metrics that we're able to use there.
What's the most difficult decision you've had to make so far?
Most difficult decision
with Neo or Skip, or let's talk about Neo first.
Yeah. Most difficult decision. I feel like there's a lot of I guess like decisions are always. I always try to like not necessarily have regret on decisions. It's more around like every decision that we make. If it's if we're able to change it, then it's just a matter of like what are the contingency plans around each decision we make. So I don't really see that. I feel like most decisions are difficult in a sense of, we want to make sure that we are putting our best foot forward. But it's less about the decision itself. It's more around, well, what if it doesn't work? What else are we going to do? But in terms of specific example, I don't have one.
But it looks like Neo's working quite well. So I don't see a lot of regrets so far.
I think it's one of those things where in a startup, you have these targets, right? But if you're meeting those targets, the bar just gets higher. And in any startup, you can always grow more. You never really hit a target because, we're not number one yet, right? We don't have 15 million customers yet. So it's always that, there's less about the time frame of a target. It's more of okay, here's the end state we want to get to. So how do we work backwards from there? And that's why it's like, there's a lot more we can do. Probably the main thing to say. Speaking
of a lot more you can do, I need to ask you a numbers question.
Sure.
And this was given to me by one of my colleagues at the Edwards School of Business. When he taught you back in, let me get the numbers right, in 2007,
sure,
he taught you managerial accounting.
Yeah.
You got now you need to help me with this because this seems astronomically impossible. You got a final exam mark of 105%.
I don't know
how did you 105% on a final?
Like, must have been a curve. I don't know. A very large curve.
Very large curve. Okay, you recall at all your experience, like managerial accounting?
I remember managing. I think it was Suresh, right? And I remember that class being extremely difficult. But I didn't go into accounting. So I don't know if that says anything. I went up going to finance instead.
Okay, you got a 97 in the class. So.
I apparently did.
What was the 3% that you missed? I
always got debits and credits confused. So
that's phenomenal.
Yeah, no, I forgot about that. Yeah.
Okay. Thinking back to your days, you talked about Skip the Dishes, going on 17th Avenue, in essence, door to door.
Yeah.
What kind of skills did you learn or abilities from that experience?
I think that's the one thing that U of S did not teach me was sales skills. I think we need to have that in classes and in courses in any sort of university, regardless of what degree you take, whether it's medicine or vet med or whatever it might be. Sales is like one thing that
Yes.
we've just had to learn on our own. And yeah, I mean, our first like meetings that we would do, well, first off, like back in the day in like Saskatoon, my co-founder, like we would have, the website wasn't done yet. So we would be selling before the product was finished. So we would have an iPad, right? And iPads were a new thing back then. And then we'd have a PDF of the website. So it looked like the website, but every time you would present it, the owners would try to touch the screen, but you keep backing away because it wouldn't work. But I think through that experience, you just learn a lot about learning how to bounce back from a ton of no's, and then just trying to figure out how to not take no for an answer is probably another thing. And it's more just like learning through that experience of like, okay, well, why did they say no? How do we learn from that? So every single night we would come back to our, Airbnb and basically game plan, put all of our feedback on paper and say, okay, well, why did, we basically role play every single night. And that's how we refined our pitches, refined all of that until we could hire people to take that on. But us alone, we signed up the first several hundred sort of places, flew to Ottawa, Calgary, Edmonton, obviously did Saskatoon, Winnipeg, Regina, Red Deer as well. Yeah.
Your comment about sales, that making that sales transaction is well stated. So that's an important task you've articulated. So thank you for that observation. Can you give us a little bit of a sense in terms of timing of Neo? Now, obviously, May 2022 was when you had the huge fundraiser and the $1 billion valuation, but just dial us back a little bit in terms of when the idea was conceived and sort of the steps that happened to get you to that point.
Yeah. So, I mean, Neo was the idea itself was sort of a culmination of just trying to figure out what to do next. Probably back in at the end of 2018. That was sort of just ideation stage, bouncing ideas off of different people, figuring out, Googling how to, start a fintech or how to start a credit card. These are all things that you sort of just do in that process to learn. But 2019 is sort of where we made our first hire. Our first office was the Calgary Public Library because it was free. And in the startup, you just want to bootstrap and save money. So we literally occupied a boardroom at the library. Thank you, taxes. I pay them, so it's great. And yeah, we made our hires. We did interviews there. And then 2019 basically took us about 18 months to develop the platform, start building relationships, partnerships, get our bank partners on board as well. And we launched sort of our beta, end of 2020, and then launched nationally beginning of 2021.
And you're doing this a lot of it during the midst of a global pandemic. So
and then the pandemic hit, yes.
Yeah. So what impact did COVID, if any, have in sort of Neo's growth or its platform progression?
Yeah, I mean, because we weren't necessarily live yet, it actually helped because we were literally just heads down. No one could go anywhere anyways. So we would just work. But so that was good on that side. We actually raised our Series A as the borders were shutting down. So I was sort of flying from city to city. And then I had to come back because I was going to get stuck in the US. But ended up sort of finishing our fundraise remotely. And since then have done our fundraises mostly remote. Until I guess now, I think pandemic's almost over. So, yeah, so that's sort of the impact that it's had. But overall, we were in that midst. We were also signing up these local businesses that were, greatly impacted by the pandemic. And I'd say, it was definitely, in the talking to us versus trying to keep their lights on and pay rent. Definitely deprioritize our conversations during that time. So that was a minor impact, but in the long run, we sort of knew that it was just more of a blip across the board.
Now you talked about your experiences, obviously with Neo Financial and the tremendous successes you've had. Are there days thinking back that you miss Skip?
No, not at all.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think it's I like to just think ahead and think forward and versus like what if scenarios and situations. So
when you order food, do you order from them?
I do, yeah.
Okay, do you get like lifetime status or something?
You know what? There's one thing I did not negotiate when I left. Everyone always asks like, do I have like a permanent coupon? I unfortunately do not have one. Maybe I should go back, but I didn't get one. I feel full price. Yeah.
Now, being an entrepreneur with the companies you've helped to establish, entrepreneurship, it's not an 8:30, you start your day, and then at 4:30, the whistle blows and you're done for the day. How do you deal with just balancing life in terms of being like fully immersed in the business, recognizing you've got other demands on your time? How do you navigate all the different items that are part of the plate of Andrew Chau?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of that is, a couple of different things. I think one, having, a good support system that understands the work that an entrepreneur is or a founder is really, really important, because there are times where you do need to pick up the phone, you do need to make a call. It's, 11 p.m. and you're still on a conference call, whatever it might be. So I think that's, first and foremost, really important. But in terms of like mentally compartmentalizing, on and off, I think it's really hard to just completely turn off. And I think when you are in it, and it's something that we really try to look for when we bring people on board, the company, is also just people who really enjoy it, right? And when you really enjoy it, there isn't, people talk about work-life balance, but it's more of an integration. And it's more around, okay, if you really enjoy it, yes, you may be reading something on the internet, but in my head, it's always around, well, how does this apply to Neo in a way? So that's why, it doesn't feel like you're working from time to time, because you're enjoying it. Yeah.
So if we could invent a time machine and take Andrew Chau back 15 years ago to 2007, taking Suresh's managerial accounting class, 105 on the final exam, 97% overall, what advice would Andrew Chau of 2022 give to the Andrew Chau of 2007?
It's one of those things with hindsight. I don't know if I would change anything. And I know people usually have these answers of like, you should have done this, or you should have did this more. But at the same time, things happen for a reason. And, me moving to Toronto, getting that experience, meeting more individuals, those sort of like have chain reaction events to, what's happened today. Right. And I think like, if I were to say, hey, I should have jumped into entrepreneurship faster, I may not have had that experience in the past. So it's a cop-out answer to that, but it's one that, I do believe in, is like, I would just say, continue doing what you're doing. And of course, there's like things that you learn. You think you're like, know everything when you're, that young. And then you realize that's probably one thing, is like, let's say you don't know everything. So there's a lot more to learn. Yeah.
What makes a good leader?
I think what makes a good leader is someone who can inspire and just get people believing in what you believe equally, if not more, than that. I think that's like a core part of building a team and a core part of leading. And there's many different ways of doing that. Whether it's very explicitly, very like lead by example, different ways of facilitating it. But I think that's the core piece that I would define as a good leader.
Is there a role model you have when you think of either leadership examples you've seen in your career, or just a style that you've adopted, or somebody that you've looked up to as a model?
I would say, I think for me, a lot of people say, oh, I've got, Elon Musk, or like, Jeff Bezos and all these other players. And I think, again, there's elements of like styles, elements of pieces, but at the end of the day, like every single person in this room, on the call, like everyone's unique. So you sort of take into what works for you and your own style. And I've sort of learned to accept that, where I'm good at certain things, I'm not as good at other things. So how do you ensure you can build a team around the areas you're not as good at? And that's sort of my style, is more around like just, embodying what we're trying to do. and letting people who are really good at doing things execute on that.
How do you maintain like being a leader? That's a wonderful response.
Yeah.
How do you maintain that vision of being a leader with an organization of 650 individuals that's growing? How do you sort of maintain that vision yet also the ability to be connected with the people who are making the organization flourish?
Yeah, no, I think it's at a certain point in time, you try to know every single person's name, and I definitely make a concerted effort. But at the same time, I think one of the big things is just having a really strong team around you that sort of knows what the goals and objectives are and where we're heading from a short term, medium term, long term, and then being able to cascade that through the rest of the org. And then at Neo, we've got team huddles where we get everyone aligned in terms of where we're going, updates on the business, getting people connected sort of in that form or fashion. And then tactically and things that we do deliberately at Neo, like we don't have offices. Everyone is sort of open. It's a very open sort of concept. I don't have my own sort of physical office. I roam around. I squat a lot in meeting rooms that people try to book and then have to move. But it's sort of like, I think for us, it's one of those things where, people can just Slack me or like message me and ask a question. People can come up to me. It's making sure we keep a relatively flat organization. And I think that's the key, especially in a startup. Yes, we've grown really quickly, but we're all still learning what we're doing, right? We're still building process. We're still building playbooks of how to do things. Every couple of months, we're launching new features. We're launching new businesses. So, and we're all sort of becoming experts in our own specific areas, right? So there's not, empire building or anything happening. It's more around, okay, how do we just make sure we're all drumming to the same beat and we're all moving in the right direction? And how we get there you may shift or shimmy left or right, depending on how things go.
I've heard the prairie's called the Silicon Prairie, Waterloo of the West. What is it about the prairies that's helping it to emerge as a real tech hub? Obviously your experiences of really growing these organizations. Is there something that you see as a leader in this space that's giving you that signal that there's some opportunities out there, or what's sort of driving a lot of these innovations? Yeah,
it's I think, it all comes down to like, I would say work ethic and people, right? And it's part of my experience sort of working abroad as well, where, I was working alongside people who went to Harvard and Stanford and coming from Saskatoon, where, you don't know everyone, all your friends aren't all from Harvard, right? You're like, oh, Harvard, you like put them on a pedestal or whatever it may be. At the same time, you when you work with them and get to know them, you realize, oh, like, I can keep up with these people who are Harvard educated or whatever it might be. And I think a big part of why the prairies is such an advantage is that, we have this unencumbered, like egoless work ethic to just become better and do the best that we can do. And I think that like entrepreneurial attitude is something that, we try to instill and try to continue to build up. And a big part of that, I believe, is more around exposure to the opportunity that we can do a lot more, right? We can build these massive tech companies. We can build these brands right here at home. And that's sort of, why we've chosen to continue to build, here in the prairies. Because there is a ton of talent, and it is one of those things where you're sort of a bigger fish in a smaller pond, and you can actually build something really meaningful here.
I love that statement, to create value while being egoless. I think that's a tremendous way of looking at it. I want to make sure that there's questions for our audience participants here, as well as virtually those who are joining us live stream. But if I could maybe just ask a question here. Sure. Maybe describe the typical day or the week of the CEO of Neo Financial. Is it, and if you want to quantify it, are you doing like 75 hours a week? Is it 80? Like, is it insane times, or is it just, it's hard to predict from week to week?
I think it depends on week to week. And I would say that it is, I'm trying to get a lot better in terms of having more allocated thinking time to think ahead. Yeah. But I would say, days are generally filled with more just making sure things are moving forward. So it's like a lot of meetings, but it's meetings with different teams. I'd say, so my specific role and the way we split out our team and our executive team is I'm more of the external sort of side of the business. And then I have my other co-founders more of the internal side, managing the day-to-day operations, the more logistical sort of components, the more the people side. But I'd say a big chunk of my time is on recruitment. A big chunk of my time is on investors, bank partners, external relations. And then the other part is more strategy in terms of what are we going to do next in the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months? And how do we ensure we have the team, the resources, the ideas, whatever it may be, to like get those into motion to get the teams working on it in the 6-month time.
So just so people who are here are aware, so you're 650 employees. So your geographic split, they're primarily here in Calgary, are spread throughout different communities?
Yeah, no, we are about 500 here in Calgary and about 150 in Winnipeg.
In Winnipeg, okay.
Yeah, so it's 650 total, give or take.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And typical background is usually people from either a business or an engineering space, IT, or all of the map.
All of the above.
All of the above.
We've got, so product. So those are the folks that will help design and figure out what does a feature look like. So they'll scope out, all the requirements on that. We've got software engineering, software development. That's a big chunk of our team as well. So they're the ones all doing the coding, keeping the lights on when it comes to our apps and website. We've got marketing, we've got designers, we have finance and accounting, we have credit risk, we have fraud strategy, we've got sales and partnerships. We've got a whole host of different roles at Neo.
What keeps you up at night?
Oh, what keeps me up at night? Well, I have an 18-month-old, so he likes to wake up really, really early.
This and a family.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Andrew.
But outside of those things, I think the biggest thing that we're always focused on as a startup, startups live and die by growth. So if you're not growing, you're no longer a startup. So that's always sort of on the top of my mind is how do we grow? How do we continue to grow, and what's stopping us from growing? And sometimes that's capital, sometimes that's people, hiring, getting great people, marketing, whatever it might be. But I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things that fall into that bucket.
What makes you most proud about being a dad?
The way that they learn and absorb everything, it's really cool. It's a brand new experience, and it's something that obviously I've never done before. This is my first, so it's definitely a learning curve for sure. And it's one of those learning curves where like in a startup, you can try to solve and deduce like why things are happening, right? But with a kid or a baby or a toddler, or whatever age it is, like sometimes there's irrational and they don't make any sense. And you're like, well, how do you break this down into a problem? And you can't because they won't listen. So you just deal with it. Anyways, you learn as you go.
Well, I have a handful of other questions I'd like to ask Andrew, but I also want to ensure that people here in our audience at the USask Hub, as well as those joining a live stream, have a chance to with any questions. So, Stephen,
did you want can they hear you? You need the mic?
If you yell, I'll repeat it for the live stream.
Okay.
Andrew, I love the statement that you said just now, where if I can paraphrase, you put your University of Saskatchewan education against almost anything. You mentioned Harvard. I'd love you to expand on that.
Yeah.
If you got specific examples of why your US education can compete with anyone in the world.
Yeah.
Okay. For the live stream, the question from Stephen, in terms of why you'd put that University of Saskatchewan education at that real excellent level compared to what you might get, the skills and abilities that you learned as part of your Bcom.
I think a big part of that experience is really on how you, or at least for myself, and observing, is how you apply it in real life, right? I think education sort of gets you sort of part of that way there, and it sort of gives you that baseline. But and I'm sure all of us can speak to it. Everything you do in your job afterwards, you typically learn on the job, and you sort of have this core base of skills of how to learn, how to be curious, how to critically think, how to problem solve. Those are things that you sort of learn across the board. I think one thing that, what we do lack in cities that are smaller or that aren't, in Stanford or whatever it might be is, what we do lack is that exposure to having a friend who started Facebook or a friend who started and built a company and sold it already, to provide those, more or less, I like to call it more like maximas of like thinking. So, in high school, I thought, I didn't really know what any jobs were. You sort of know what you only know. But when you're able, like when you get more exposed, and that's where what we're trying to do with Neo and Skip and all these, and try to create an ecosystem around technology, just showing people there are different opportunities to build a career in different spaces, like whether it's tech or other areas as well. So that's sort of what I'd say, how I think about comparing across different like universities and stuff in colleges. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation, the two of you. It's been really great.
Great.
I know
Thank you.
next to nothing about this kind of a process, but you mentioned fundraising a few times. Could you just talk about the nature of the fundraising, like who you go to, when you go to, what are milestones at the fundraising? Like,
Sure.
So the question about the milestones of fundraising and how does one go about this important activity?
Yeah, so fundraising. So this is capital raising, finding investors to invest in Neo. And I would say there are many different stages of fundraising, depending on where your company is at. So at the very beginning, it's, basically finding people who believe in your idea because you don't have any traction, you have no customers. So you find investors or you fund the business yourself. So for example, with Skip the Dishes, we did not have outside investors for the first 3 years of the business. So we sort of self-funded with our own money and also just with the business itself. And it's called bootstrapping. And then eventually we brought in investors who invested in the business. And then you sort of use that money to continue growing. Yeah, exactly. So, through that process, there's probably a lot more to it, but there's just different stages at which companies would fundraise. And does that answer part of the question?
but is that still ongoing for you now?
Yeah, it is. I would say it doesn't happen like every single day. It's more of a when you need cash or you have milestones that you've hit and you're looking to accelerate your growth. So for Neo, for example, we've gone through 4 different rounds of funding. And sort of our next one, if we choose to do another round, would be, a couple of years from now type thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think Ibrahim had a question. I think a really important point you make, Andrew, is that during those early years, you talked about the 3 years of Skip the Dishes where there was no external funding. I guess as an entrepreneur, before you can get a chance to eat the steak, you got to be willing to eat the mac and cheese. Nothing against mac and cheese, but you've got to, it's not all immediately like golden sidewalks in the very beginning. It's the arduous hard work and the day-to-day grind of getting through those challenging periods of turbulence.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there are a number of stories that are examples of us like really pinching pennies, and whether it's like sleeping on friends' floors or sharing beds at Airbnbs, like just to save a couple $100 in rent. There's just things like that where, at one point in time, we were sitting on boxes because we ran out of chairs in our office. But you sort of do these things and it's just a part of that journey of building a startup. And, I think it's like obviously squatting in a library, like these just things. These are just things that, come with the nature of, okay, for every dollar that we have, we could either put it into a chair. Well, chairs are obviously valuable, but into rent, or we could put it into, okay, how do we get a new hire to help build this app, right?
Well said.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ibrahim, you had a question.
Yes, well, thank you both for the presentation. It's absolutely great. But more about your thought, you said you want to compete with the big 5 and actually really get into the banking space. Being in the banking space requires a lot of new commercial and business kind of space. How is that planned for Neo down the line?
Okay. So the question in terms of the opportunities for Neo within that the business banking space and that environment.
Yeah. So the short answer of, how do we think about commercial and business in short, yes, eventually we will get into that space. I think it's just a matter of prioritization of where we are focused on today. And on today, it's more on the consumer side. It's around building this, ecosystem of merchants and retailers and consumers. But, much like what all the banks sort of already do today is business and commercial, and there's a massive opportunity in that space too. Yeah. Art.
Andrew, just to add on to that, you mentioned oligopolies and maybe monopolies for Canadian banks. Is there any one particular regulation that's restricting you now or that you want change for the government?
Okay. Any regulation or restriction that you'd be looking for the government to change regarding the banking industry in Canada?
So it's one of those things where for us, we've been able to build essentially, working with banks. Actually, we work with banks today for context. So all the money that's held in a neobank account is actually held at a bank. Because we're not a bank ourselves, we're a financial technology company. So all the money is actually the same money that would be held at RBC or TD or Scotia. So that's the unique thing about what we built is we built technology to enable, a really great consumer experience, but still have the safety and security of a bank. So when we think about regulation, we've actually been able to abide by all Canadian regulations, regulatory sort of frameworks, and still offer that tech-enabled experience. So I wouldn't say, there's any particular rules or regulations that are stopping us from doing what we're doing today. But there are certain aspects of how open the government is to allow for more competition. So there's things like open banking, if you guys have heard of that, which is essentially something that has been introduced in other countries like the UK, Australia, essentially encouraging more competition, allowing it easier for fintechs or for consumers to share their data. So an example of that is, if you have all 25 years worth of data at RBC, right now RBC owns that. So if you try to switch to TD, you can't, right? It's a very arduous process. So what's trying to be pushed through government is something called open banking, which is essentially saying, hey, we will make it easier for you to transfer that data if you want it because it's yours. But of course, government, those things are a little slow. So it's been in the works for a long time. But that's the idea of a regulation, an example of regulation that would be very helpful in terms of improving competition in the space. Yeah.
Read had a question.
Do you have any plans of working with cryptos at all?
Crypto?
Yeah, plan working with crypto. Go ahead.
Crypto's the cool thing, right? I think in short, I'd say we have it on the horizon of enabling everyday Canadians with access with it that's trusted. I think that's one thing that is missing is no one really knows who these players are, what it means. So being able to provide that education around it is something that we're definitely looking into. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I just want to say thank you for hosting this and being here. You're such a grounded and magnetic person to watch, and everybody at US is really proud of you. So we're going to continue to watch your success. In addition to being a grounded and magnetic leader, I'm wondering how you're attracting great people. For those of us working in business right now, this so-called war for talent and this purpose revolution is really changing the way people work, and it's made it challenging for some employers. I'm wondering, how are you finding great people, and what's your promise when it comes to
recruitment strategies? How do you find great people in the competitive situation, the environment of today?
It's a great question. I think people always ask the question, is it hard to recruit? And I think for any business, I think everyone says it's really hard to recruit, right? Because you're always trying to find people for your business that fit your culture, that have the right skill sets, that have all these things. So I don't think anyone's immune to, a really, really hard recruitment sort of industry, right? I think for us and sort of how we've been able to attract talent, it's definitely hasn't been easy. It's extremely challenging, right? Because when you tell someone, hey, you're going to be working really, really hard, it's extremely fulfilling. But we're not a large big five bank. So compensation is still very good, but it's more on upside and equity or options because we sort of compensate, not just on a salary, but we sort of backweight a lot of that with the success of the company, right? So I think for us, it's been really around just running a really strong recruitment process, having a strong network, and to be honest, just like keeping our bar really, really high. I don't think there's anything like any secret sauce to it. It's really around getting our message out there, and finding the right people that maintain that same culture that we want to embody, right? And not really straying away from that, because I think once you do, then you start to you dilute more and more as you sort of go down that path. So we've really been keeping that bar high across the board and maintaining that. Yeah.
Go to Carly. Do you have a question from our remote
internets?
From Fiona from the chat, she asks, how do you know / evaluate the consistency and quality of the customer experience?
Okay, how do you evaluate the consistency of the customer experience at Neo?
Yeah, I think when you deal with a lot of customers, whether it's hundreds of thousands or millions of customers, obviously customer experience consistency is really, really key. I think a big part of that is having process checks and balances, and then also just so that's one part, is around making sure you have the right training, the right playbooks, the right process, so that things don't fall through the cracks. I think that's a lot of time what happens with customer support, or there's just gaps in knowledge when things do break down. I think the second is ensuring that you bring on, again, the right people that do feel empowered to make those decisions, or at least to have the ability to make decisions to make sure customers or the experience is consistent. But that's probably one thing that is always extremely difficult to do when when you're in a really high volume business, or there's emails coming left and right, in-app chats, and then you're also hiring, hundreds of people a year type thing, making sure everyone sort of follows that same consistent culture, the way we talk, the tone, all that kind of stuff as well. Yeah.
Do a lot of your employees tend to, out of the 650 with Calgary and Winnipeg, do they tend to have that office location, you said, where it's more of like a hoteling system, or are they working from home remotely in that situation?
Yeah, so we for Neo, because we've been sort of growing relatively quickly, we are, I'd say, more in office first here in Winnipeg and in Calgary. I would say we, when you're spending all this time with people, and sort of our mentality is you're spending all this time working, collaborating, being able to whiteboard something really quickly is quite important. Being able to, have that small talk, getting to know the people you're working with. We were remote for quite some time during the pandemic, and it's really tough to have that small talk when you haven't really seen that person face to face. So it's something that, we do value, and so yeah, that's why we have our offices in Calgary and Winnipeg. Yeah.
Ibrahim?
Yeah.
There's one more question, something you brought up.
Sure.
About the series of being dilutive. Are all the series that you say, are they dilutive, non-dilutive funding? And the next question is, based on VC, usually there are some milestones that you have to make it kind of through. Are there any future milestones that are kind of make it or break it for Neo?
So the milestones of venture capital in terms of what might make or break you as you go forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. In terms of the rounds that we've done, they're all equity rounds, so they are selling parts of the company to investors. And in terms of the milestones, I think there's always milestones tied to sort of every round, and I think without getting to specifics, it's yes, there's milestones for the next rounds or whatever they might be, but ultimately, investors, especially venture capital investors, invest for the long term, right? They generally invest for a 10-year plus horizon. They're not looking to buy and sell in 1 or 2 years. They are sort of long-term investors, and because of that, it's the milestones, the short-term milestones help sort of figure out how much you raise and what the next thing is, but ultimately, they're in it with the same reason why we're in it too, in terms of that ambition to be a top 5 bank in Canada, right? And that's really, what they're really, that for them, that's the outcome. And then how you get there and the number of rounds and the type of investors are sort of all in the middle of that. Yeah.
I think Carly had a question. Before we do that, who picked the name Neo?
I think I did.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Good choice.
I mean, it was like probably myself, and we were just like batting around names. But to be honest, we didn't have many other names. But Neo, yeah, Neo was again, going back to Google. You Google like, what's the best type of names to name your company, and like you get a list, and you can Google it today too. You get a list, and it's like, make sure the name is like memorable, make sure it's short, you know, less 2 syllables or less. So we're like, okay, well, Neo fits the molds. And then and make sure the domain is available. So neo.com was not available, but Neo Financial was. So that's why. And then it also enabled us to grow outside of just the card. So we had Neo Card, and then we knew we wanted to launch like investments. So we have Neo Invest, Neo Mortgage, Neo Bank Accounts, Neo Crypto, whatever that you can append to. Neo obviously means new in Latin. And that's sort of what embodies what we're trying to build as well.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Carly.
How do you make a decision around cash flow versus growth? So, for example, borrow money to invest in to make a more compound product versus getting cash flow positive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like the fellow who got 105 on the final exam in accounting. So a question about cash flow making decisions.
Cash flow making decisions. Yeah, I think it's always a balancing act between you know, investing for growth versus hitting profitability faster or cash flow faster. I think that decision changes over time depending on investor appetite and depending on the market you're going after. But ultimately, what it comes down to is, do I believe a dollar, you know, invested into the company can generate future returns exponentially because there's a market to go after? And I would say, you know, whether it's in food delivery, in any technology company that's fast growth or high growth, it's sort of the name of the game of a venture business, where you want to grow your market share, you know, as quickly as you can, but you want to do it in a reasonable way. So I would say, you know, it is always a balancing act for growth, and you just balance that profitability to make sure, you know, it matches what investors want as well. Yeah.
How do you, as a CEO of Neo, how do you ensure that the company doesn't become overtaken by Neo 2.0 or by, you know, competitors that might exist out there, or maybe there are huge barriers to entry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that we think about all the time, but it's also one thing that, you know, we focus on what we're really good at and just execute. And I think,
what are you good at?
I think we're good. So like the advantages that we have as a tech company versus, let's just say, incumbent banks is sort of speed, but speed really comes from the people that we bring on board. Yeah. So maintaining that culture, the fact that, you know, we have built everything from scratch. So our entire banking system, our entire card processing, the apps, the experience, we actually built that all from scratch. We're not using third-party IBM software. Hopefully no one's at IBM or SAP. But you know, this is all things that we had built from scratch, which provides us with that advantage. And maintaining that advantage is really, really important. So can banks, you know, banks have billions and billions of dollars. Can they build what we built? They could. And we probably have a couple-year advantage over them, right? So it's maintaining that advantage and that head start, and maintaining it the entire time all the way through. And that's sort of how we think about competition. And it's you know, about competition is more around, we are our biggest, you know, blocker, because, you know, it's just a matter of how fast we want to move ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah, you can never be stuck in neutral in this environment. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. You mentioned open banking and some of the strategies that you made. You talked about the big 5 banks. You know how fast fintechs moving in the US and in Europe.
Yep.
When you think of what's your long-term strategy, whether it's commercial banking or working closer with big banks, Canada, or kind of going up against SAP or Finastra or Backbase. You know, what do you think about in terms of strategy? And with open banking, are you looking to cross-license any of the technologies you have?
Yeah, I'll just summarize that with the long-term outlook for Neo and what's happening with some of the strategies that's being articulated.
Yeah, I mean, I think with open banking, obviously it allows you know, more competition, especially for fintechs and other players and banking as a service players to come into and platforms to come into play and sort of grow to these net new businesses. I think for Neo, one of the best things about Neo or about us is that we are already a tech company. So there's less for us to really think through of like, hey, we need to migrate our system to something that's more agile or API driven, because we're already sort of, our platform was built off of that anyway. So those standards sort of come into play, we can adapt to that relatively quickly. In terms of licensing our technology and letting others use it, I mean, that's always a question that we have strategically. I wouldn't say anything that that is necessarily like our priority today, but it's something that we're always looking at for sure. Yeah.
I'll bring us to a close here. I've got 3 more questions I want to ask you. I guess I control the mic here so I can control some questions. So when Andrew Chau is awarded top 40 under 40 across the globe, what will the headline say?
Outside of the top 40 under 40. That's a good question. What do these headlines typically say?
Unfortunately, I'm over 40. I'm not under 40, so I'm disqualified. How would I guess the rest of sort of the world in general think of the implications you've created in terms of your entrepreneurial vision? So I guess, what are you most proud of when you think of the experiences that you've had with your opportunities since your Bcom?
I would say, the biggest thing that we wanted to do with Skip and we're doing now with Neo is everyone always tries to focus on like one niche of like a customer in Canada, but we've always been on the nature of, well, how do we just reach everyone, right? And I think like a lot of people ignore, I'd say, the average Canadian, like everyone just sort of thinks of themselves as the average Canadian, but ultimately there's 38 million Canadians. There's a lot of people out there, and we want to build products that serve everyone, not just high net worth, not just the underbanked, but sort of everybody. And we sort of had that same mentality at Skip sort of later on with Neo, sort of the same thing. So if I were to like choose a headline, I think it's like, I'm trying to think of, I'm not very good at headlines. So
always alliteration.
Yeah.
Neo quite new.
I don't know. It could be, we could use a matrix reference if we really want to get into it.
Exactly. Okay. So question number 2, thinking back, how would you characterize the culture at Neo and maybe compare that to Skip?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably a similar sort of culture a principle that we always try to have is just ownership and accountability, especially in a startup where everyone is an owner and there isn't people you can like hide behind in a large corporate bureaucratic organization. So everyone needs to be able to like be accountable to the actions, to the projects, to the work that you're doing, because there's really only one person that's doing it, and that's that person. And I think that's how we think about that. And I think the other piece is in a startup where it's extremely fast paced. So being able to ensure that, we are never the blocker. So if you ever were the blocker of something, if someone's waiting on you, how do we ensure we unblock that? And that's sort of how we operate. That way it's less about like hardcore process or anything like that. It's really on principles. And that's sort of how we think about, the culture at Neo. Yeah.
Excellent. And at the end of the day, is there life after? What's life look like after Neo? Is the vision that you've got going forward? Is there the future entrepreneurial vision that you'll have? Is there the next great idea that's out there on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, the opportunity with Neo is so massive that it's like the main focus at the time. Like at the end of the day, we're looking to build a generational company. It's something that we like. I think the ultimate goal is, we want Neo to last 100+ years, right? And I think that's the time frame that we were operating off of, which is quite different to a lot of other time frames that people might have. But that's sort of how we think about the decisions we make today and the investments we make, the people we bring on board. Obviously, we don't expect people to stay for 100 years, but it's one of those things that okay, how do we ensure this is going to be something that is that can literally be generational across and be something that's like a meaningful impact to Canadians.
Yeah, maybe a wonderful way of summarizing tonight's conversation, creating that generational impact of you. Bcom grad from the University of Saskatchewan Edwards School of Business, creating value that lasts forever. Andrew, on behalf of our guests here, I would thank you. Thank you for your position and your passion. I think your opportunity of really describing the value that you saw within Skip the Dishes, with Neo Financial, with talking to us about and educating us about banking industry and trends and things you're seeing to bring value to more of us so we can all participate meaningfully together in the economy. I think your vision is tremendous. And I thank you for your energy. Thank you for your passion, and thank you for giving us of your time tonight.
Thank you.
I want to take this time, Andrew, thoroughly to congratulate you for representing superbly what it means, as Stephen Flynn asked in the first question, that the value of your experience that you've had as the University of Saskatchewan Edwards School of Business student, but then translating that into the tremendous careers that you've had since then. Thank you to our wonderful advancement team, the Edwards School of Business, Megan Cantwell, Steph Bodnar, Carly Snow. Thank you for helping us to coordinate and deliver our first ever Dean Speaker Series held here in Calgary. I'd love to come back. This is a tremendous venue with a great speaker. Thank you to our staff here tonight who've helped us in the USask Hub, both in terms of preparing the logistics and the event, helping us with the audio and the visual. You've educated us.
Thank you.
We'll be downloading some apps right away. So
perfect.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks.